Welcome to our deep dive, all about depression. We'll be taking a really close look today at an atlas of depression by David S. Baldwin and Jon Birtwistle. We want to give you a really clear understanding of depression.
It's a great book. I mean, it's really interesting because it combines research with illustrations, which is so helpful because depression can be a really hard thing to wrap your head around sometimes.
Yeah, and it can feel so isolating,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But it affects so many people.
It does. It does. And one of the first things that the book really emphasizes is that it's not just feeling a bit down. This is a serious condition and it can really have a huge impact on your life.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I noticed is the book mentions so many different symptoms, but some of them seem really debilitating. What were some of the ones that really jumped out at you?
Well, one of the hallmarks is this loss of interest in things that you used to enjoy, even simple pleasures. So you might find that you're really struggling to engage in hobbies or social activities or even just like spending time with loved ones.
It's like all the colored greens out of life, right?
Exactly, yeah. And this often goes hand in hand with just persistent low mood and just like really reduced energy levels. Even simple tasks can feel really overwhelming.
Yeah, I felt that that feeling of exhaustion really came through in the book. It's not just like physical tiredness. It's like this deep emotional fatigue that just makes it so hard to function.
Yeah, it's heavy. It's heavy. And then here's where things get even more sort of complex. And I think the book really highlights this well, is just how closely anxiety and depression are linked. They're really two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And they often coexist.
It makes sense if you think about it, right? Like if you're constantly worried and on edge, that's going to affect your mood and your energy levels.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's really important to remember these symptoms aren't signs of weakness.
Right.
They're the result of complex biological, psychological, and social factors.
Yeah. And that brings us to this kind of alarming statistic from the book. Depression is the 5th leading cause of worldwide disability.
Wow.
I was pretty shocked to read that.
It's huge. And it
Yeah.
really is a reminder that we need to be talking about this more. It's a very real condition that has, a significant impact, globally.
It's definitely not a rare condition.
No, not at all.
So let's talk about diagnosis. The book sort of dives into the epidemiology of depression, which is essentially how we measure its frequency. And it talks about the difference between incidence and prevalence. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So incidence is talking about the number of new cases, within a specific time frame,
Okay.
whereas prevalence tells us the proportion of the population experiencing depression at a given point in time.
Got it. So incidence is like a snapshot.
Mm.
Okay, how many people are newly diagnosed, and then prevalence is like a broader view
Yeah.
of how many people are currently living with it.
That's exactly right. And what we see globally is that, about 15% of the population report experiencing depressive symptoms, and 10% of primary care visits are actually related to depression.
Wow, that's a big chunk of the population.
It is. It is. And, when we look at the data, there are some fascinating gender differences. So women are about twice as likely to experience depression compared to men.
Now, if genetics don't fully explain that, what other factors could be at play?
Well, the book explores, a number of possibilities, things like childcare responsibilities and societal pressures that are unique to what women, right, might contribute. And there's also the question of just reporting differences. Maybe men and women tend to report their emotional struggles in different ways.
Yeah. It makes you think about, how much our social roles and expectations really influence our mental health.
It's huge. It's huge. Yeah.
And then there's the age factor, too.
Yeah.
The book mentions this kind of concerning trend, the rising incidence of depression, particularly in young men.
Yeah.
Why do you think we're seeing that?
That's a really complex question. And I don't know if we have the answers yet, but, I think we have to consider, the role of social media,
Sure.
The economic pressures that young people are facing, and just sort of like the changing social structures.
It's really something to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Another point the book makes is that depression, rarely exists alone.
Yeah.
Right? It often occurs alongside other mental health conditions, what's known as comorbidity.
Right. And that comorbidity is really key to understanding depression. So for example, Anxiety and substance abuse often go hand in hand with depression.
Right.
And that really influences, the severity of the condition and also the types of treatments that might be most effective.
So we're not just dealing with depression and isolation. We're dealing with this kind of web of different conditions
It's a way.
that can make it even more challenging to treat.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, diagnosis isn't always straightforward. The book shares this really kind of startling fact. 50% of people with major depression go unrecognized in GP waiting rooms.
Wow.
It's incredible.
Why do you think so many cases get missed?
Well, there's a number of reasons. I think, the stigma surrounding mental health can prevent people from even seeking help in the first place.
Oh.
There's this fear of being judged, of
Yeah.
being labeled.
Yeah, I can see that being a barrier, especially if you've never experienced it before. You might not even realize that what you're going through is a condition that can be treated.
Right, right, right. And then, some people might fear medication or the potential side effects. And others, might downplay their symptoms or attribute them to physical problems, and that can really mask, the underlying depression.
So it's this combination of, societal stigma and personal fears, plus just the complexity of the symptoms themselves.
So perfect storm. Yeah.
So let's talk about those different types of depression then. The book, really distinguishes between unipolar and bipolar depression. Why is this distinction so important, especially when it comes to treatment?
Because bipolar disorder involves, shifts between periods of depression and mania. And mania is characterized by, elevated mood, increased energy, sometimes even psychotic symptoms. Whereas unipolar depression, it only involves those depressive episodes.
Okay, so if you misdiagnose one for the other, you could end up giving someone the wrong treatment.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really important to make that distinction. And then within unipolar depression, there are a number of different subtypes. And, the Atlas actually does a really brilliant job of sort of visually representing these different forms.
Yeah, the illustrations were really helpful. One that really stood out to me was recurrent brief depression, or RBD. It just sounds so disruptive. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so as the name suggests, the episodes are brief, but they're incredibly intense and they're frequent, sometimes even occurring monthly.
Wow.
So, you can imagine how these sudden plunges into, deep depression could really disrupt your life,
Yeah.
make it hard to maintain work, relationships, just a sense of stability.
It's like being on an emotional roller coaster.
It really is.
And then the book also mentions, dysthymia, which sounds like this chronic low-grade sadness that can go on for years.
Yeah, it can really, really drag you down because it's just this constant, shadow hanging over you.
Yeah.
And then the book also touches on, seasonal affective disorder,
Right.
postpartum depression, and this mixed anxiety depressive disorder.
So many different ways that it can manifest.
Exactly.
So we've talked about, depression, the different types, but anxiety is such a frequent companion, Let's talk about anxiety disorders. What kinds of anxieties does the book cover?
Well, the book, takes us through this whole landscape of anxiety,
Yeah.
from generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social phobia, post-traumatic stress disorder,
Right.
obsessive compulsive disorder. I mean, you name it, it's in there.
What I really appreciated was how it brought these, disorders to life with like specific examples.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's one of the things that makes it so readable and so relatable.
Yeah.
Instead of just giving us these clinical definitions, it gives us these real life scenarios that really illustrate, how these conditions manifest,
Right.
Like, for example, it talks about phobias, like fear of flying or spiders,
Those are pretty common ones. But I think the question a lot of people have is, when does anxiety cross the line? When does it go from being a normal response to stress to something that's, more serious?
Well, I think, the key is to recognize when it becomes excessive, when it's prolonged, or when it starts to, significantly disrupt your life. If it's interfering with your work, your relationships, your overall well-being, that's when you really need to seek help.
So it's not about eliminating it altogether. It's about, learning to manage it.
Yeah, for sure.
And speaking of seeking help, the book doesn't shy away from talking about suicide,
No.
which is obviously a very difficult topic.
Yeah.
And it presents some really stark statistics that I think highlight how serious this issue is.
Yeah.
Suicide is the third most common cause of death globally for those between 15 and 44.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And the book really emphasizes, how important it is for GPs, general practitioners, to be able to identify
Oh.
individuals who might be at risk.
Yeah.
Especially after, maybe they've had an episode of deliberate self-harm or
Mm.
something like that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What are some of the factors that the book links to an increased risk of suicide?
Well, things like planning the act in advance, writing a suicide note, making attempts to avoid discovery, expressing a wish to die, continuing suicidal intent.
Those are all really serious warning signs.
Yeah.
And the book shares this really, really concerning statistic. 10 to 15% of those who have contact with health services after a suicide attempt will eventually die by suicide. It's a reminder that we really need to be doing more to support people who are struggling with these thoughts.
Oh, absolutely. We need effective prevention strategies and just more comprehensive support systems to help people, navigate these really difficult times.
Yeah, so we've talked about the symptoms, the different types, the relationship with anxiety, and the very real risk of suicide. But what about the root causes?
Yeah.
What causes depression in the first place?
Well, the book kind of breaks down the causes into three main areas: genetic, neurotransmitter disturbances, and then psychosocial factors.
Okay, so let's unpack those a little bit. Starting with genetics, how much does our DNA actually influence our susceptibility to depression?
Well, genetics definitely play a role, but it's not as simple as, inheriting a depression gene. It's much more complex than that. Research suggests that multiple genes are likely involved, and these genes interact with environmental factors. So it's really, this nature and nurture interplay.
So it's not a guarantee that you'll develop depression just because it runs in your family.
Exactly, exactly.
Okay. What about neurotransmitter disturbances? What role do those play?
Well, the book really focuses on three key neurotransmitters: serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And explains how imbalances in these chemicals can really contribute to depression. They're like the chemical messengers in our brain. And when their levels are off, it can impact, mood, sleep, energy,
Yeah.
a whole range of functions.
So if these neurotransmitters are out of whack, it can throw our whole system out of balance.
Exactly.
Okay, so medication can help to kind of correct those chemical imbalances,
Yeah.
but it's not the only piece of the puzzle.
No.
Right. Let's talk about psychosocial factors.
Yeah.
These seem like areas where we might have a bit more control, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where things get really, really interesting, because it's about understanding the broader context of depression.
Yeah.
The book delves into how things like adverse childhood experiences, chronic life difficulties, undesirable life events,
Right.
limited social support, low self-esteem, all of these things can contribute. So it's really this reminder that our mental health isn't just determined by what's going on in our brains.
Right.
It's about our experiences, for sure.
Our relationships, our ability to cope with the challenges that life throws our way.
Absolutely. And the book uses some really, compelling examples to illustrate how these factors can, increase our vulnerability to depression. So for example, if you've experienced trauma in childhood,
Right.
or you're dealing with chronic stress,
Right.
or if you lack social connections, these things can really make you more susceptible.
So it's not just about what's happening inside us. It's about the world around us
Absolutely.
and how we interact with it.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the question of treatment. What can we actually do to manage and overcome this complex condition?
Right. Well, the book, really emphasizes that treating depression is often a marathon,
Okay.
not a sprint. It requires a long-term approach and just a commitment to ongoing management.
So it's not a quick fix. It's about understanding the different phases of treatment
Yeah,
and developing, a plan that addresses your needs.
absolutely.
Okay. So let's talk about those phases.
Yeah.
We have remission, recovery, relapse, and recurrence.
Right.
So remission is when the symptoms subside,
Yeah.
right? But it doesn't necessarily mean it's gone for good.
That's right. That's right. Whereas recovery, signifies a more sustained period of well-being,
Okay.
typically lasting 4 to 6 months. And during that time, you're essentially back to, your pre-depression state. Relapse is when the symptoms return before you've achieved full recovery. And then recurrence is when a new episode of depression occurs after a period of recovery.
So understanding these different phases can help people set realistic expectations.
Absolutely.
Right. It's not always a straight line to recovery.
No.
There might be bumps along the way.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about some of the treatment options that are available. The book covers, a wide range, but let's start with antidepressants.
Yeah.
They can be a really important part of treatment, but they're not a magic bullet.
Right.
Different types work in different ways, and what works for one person might not work for another.
For sure. One of the first things to understand about antidepressants is that they generally target those neurotransmitters that we were talking about. So serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine.
Okay.
And essentially, they aim to correct the imbalances in these brain chemicals, which can then help to alleviate, the symptoms.
So they're not just like mood boosters. They're actually working on a deeper level.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so one class of antidepressants you might have heard of is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. They're often considered safer than, some of those older classes like tricyclic antidepressants or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, but they can still have side effects, right?
Yeah. I mean, some common side effects include things like nausea, insomnia, and sexual dysfunction. But the good news is that, these side effects are often manageable and they tend to improve over time.
And it's important to remember, everybody responds differently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's often a process of trial and error to find the right medication and the right dosage. So, work with your doctor. Be open about any side effects that you're experiencing.
Yeah.
And be patient as you figure out what works best for you.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to emphasize that, medication is only one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
The book really highlights the importance of taking a more holistic approach, which might include things like psychotherapy, lifestyle changes, and social support.
So it's about finding that right combination of things that work for you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about medication, the importance of a holistic approach, but the book also explores some other kind of unique treatments.
Yeah.
What are some of the sort of alternative approaches?
Well, one treatment that's worth mentioning is electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. And that's a really highly effective option, but it's usually reserved for, severe cases of depression where other treatments haven't worked. It involves, inducing a brief seizure under general anesthesia, which can help to reset the brain circuits involved in mood regulation.
So it's come a long way.
It has.
And it's a lot safer than it used to be.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Not the first line treatment.
Right.
But it can be a real lifeline for people.
Okay. What about light therapy? That sounds a bit more gentle.
It is, yeah. Light therapy, or phototherapy, basically involves exposure to bright light for a specific amount of time each day. And it's particularly effective for seasonal affective disorder,
right,
which, as we know, is often linked to reduced sunlight exposure. So basically, it's thought to work by resetting the body's internal clock, which influences things like our sleep-wake cycles, hormone levels, and mood.
So it helps to regulate things.
Yeah. It's generally considered safe and well tolerated, although, some people might experience, mild side effects like headaches or eye strain.
And then there's transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS.
Oh, yeah, TMS. That one sounds very futuristic.
It does, right.
But basically, it's a non-invasive treatment that uses magnetic pulses to stimulate specific areas of the brain involved in mood regulation.
Okay.
So basically, a coil is placed on the scalp, and it delivers these magnetic pulses that induce these small electrical currents in the brain. And it's pretty amazing. We can target these specific brain regions without, any surgery or medication.
So we've got a whole spectrum of treatments, from medication, psychotherapy, to these more specialized interventions. It's really about finding what works best for the individual.
Yeah. Absolutely. And speaking of finding the right path, the book really emphasizes the power of psychological therapies in treating depression.
Because it's about addressing those underlying thought patterns and behaviors that really contribute to it.
Yeah. It's about giving people the tools and skills to manage their mental health, long after therapy has ended.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the specific therapies that are mentioned, starting with cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Okay. So CBT is one of the most sort of well-researched and widely practiced therapies, and it focuses on, identifying and challenging the negative thought patterns and behaviors that contribute to depression. So it's about learning to reframe your thoughts,
Right.
develop healthier coping mechanisms, and ultimately change the way you interact with the world.
It's about changing those stories that we tell ourselves.
Exactly. And the book provides some great examples of CBT techniques,
Right.
Things like keeping a thought diary to track your negative thoughts.
Okay.
And then challenging those thoughts with evidence.
Right.
Replacing them with more balanced and realistic perspectives.
So it's about taking control of those negative thought spirals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The book also mentions interpersonal therapy, or IPT, which focuses on relationships and how they play a role in depression.
Yeah.
That seems particularly relevant given, how isolating depression can be.
Oh, for sure. IPT really explores how, relationship patterns, communication styles, social support networks can, contribute to or exacerbate depression. So it's about recognizing, how our relationships impact our mental health and then learning to build healthier, more supportive connections.
So it's not just about individual therapy then, it's about, looking at our relationships as well.
Absolutely. And it can also help people cope with, things like grief,
Right.
loss, and other major life transitions that can, trigger or worsen depression.
The book also briefly touches on bereavement counseling.
Yeah.
Which is, specifically for people who are grieving the loss of a loved one.
Right. And it can be a really, valuable resource for processing grief, working through those really complicated emotions and developing healthy ways to cope with loss.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of different psychological therapies that can be really helpful.
Yeah.
And I think, it's a good reminder that depression isn't a life sentence. It's a condition that can be managed with the right support and strategies.
Absolutely. And before we move on, there's one more crucial topic that I think is really important to touch on, and that's the impact of depression on relationships.
Yeah, I think that's something that often gets overlooked, but it's so important because it doesn't just affect the individual. It affects the people around them.
Oh, for sure. And one of the key areas the book highlights is the link between depression and sexual problems.
Right.
So a significant number of people with depression, experience a decreased interest in sex or difficulty achieving orgasm or other sexual difficulty.
The book cites some pretty, startling statistics.
Yeah.
Like 35% of men with depression experience erectile dysfunction compared to 0% of men without. That's a huge difference.
Yeah. And it really, underscores just how profound the impact can be.
Yeah.
On sexual health and intimacy. But it's really important to remember that these sexual difficulties, they are often treatable.
Okay.
Either by addressing the underlying depression or through specific interventions for sexual dysfunction.
So it's about, being open, talking to your partner, talking to your doctor, and seeking help when you need it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's not a reflection of you or your relationship. It's often a symptom of the condition itself.
Right.
And there are solutions out there.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I think, that's a really good overview of, the basics of depression.
Yeah.
What really stood out to you from the book? What left you pondering?
One of the most interesting things to me was when it talked about the limitations of what we know about depression. Like, there's still so much that we don't know.
Yeah, it's a huge, complex condition. So even with all the research that we've done, we're still trying to figure it all out.
Oh, yeah, totally. And, it kind of poses this interesting question, like, what if our current categories for depression, the way we diagnose it, what if that's too limiting?
Okay, so, like, what do you mean by that?
Well, we have these kind of neat little labels and subtypes, right? Yeah. But what if that's actually preventing us from really seeing the true diversity of what people experience and then, developing treatments that are more personalized and more effective.
So instead of just trying to put everyone into these boxes, we need to take a more nuanced approach.
Right, because everybody's experience is different.
Yeah, for sure.
And the book really challenges us to think about, what if we took a more dimensional approach? Okay.
One that focuses on the severity of symptoms.
Right.
And the individual's unique presentation.
So instead of just saying, oh, you have major depressive disorder or you have dysthymia,
right,
we actually look at the specific things that they're dealing with.
Yeah, the whole picture.
Yeah.
Their history, their challenges, and use that to come up with a more tailored plan.
I like that because it really acknowledges that depression isn't one size fits all.
No, not at all. It really is a spectrum.
Yeah. Okay, so what else really resonated with you from the book?
Well, I really appreciated how much it emphasized, the possibility of recovery.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that depression can be incredibly debilitating,
Right.
but it doesn't have to define you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not the end of your story.
Exactly. And the brain is amazingly adaptable, and with the right support, with the right interventions, people can and do recover, and they go on to live, full and meaningful lives. That's such a powerful message,
Yeah.
There's always hope.
Always. Yeah.
Even when things feel really, really tough.
And the book ends with this really great line.
Yeah.
It says, "The treatment of depression can be so rewarding. People get better. Doctors feel satisfied. The burden of depression lifts."
It's a really beautiful sentiment.
It is.
It really speaks to the possibility of healing.
Yeah, it does.
So this has been a really, really insightful deep dive.
It has.
And I think, it's given our listeners, a much deeper understanding of depression and the fact that it's so complex.
Yeah.
And that there are, so many different paths to healing.
For sure.
So if you're listening and you're feeling overwhelmed or lost, please know that you're not alone.
Yeah.
There are people who care, and there are resources available.
And there's always hope.
Yeah, always hope. We've actually put together, some additional resources for you. Books, websites, support organizations.
Great resources.
And you can find those in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely check those out. And don't hesitate to reach out for help if you need it.
Yeah.
You deserve support. And there's no shame in asking for it. Recovery is possible, and there's always hope.
Always.
Right.
Yeah, it's so inspiring, to hear those stories of recovery. It really reminds you that, depression doesn't have to be a life sentence.
It really doesn't.
You can get your life back.
Yeah.
Find joy again.
Yeah, sure.
One thing that really stood out to me from the Atlas was, how much it emphasized that, our mental health, our physical health, our social well-being are all connected.
They are, yeah.
It's not just about treating the symptoms. It's about looking at the whole person.
It's the whole picture.
So our mental health is affected by so many things.
Yeah.
Our biology, our psychology, our relationships, even our environment.
It all ties in.
And that means that recovery often involves, making changes to our lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. Things like stress management techniques.
Right.
And really building those strong social connections.
It makes sense if you're, not sleeping well.
Right.
You're stressed all the time.
Yeah.
You're isolated. It's going to make it so much harder.
Yeah, those things have a huge impact. So, the book talks about, the importance of things like exercise, a healthy diet, making sure you're getting enough sleep and spending time in nature. All of those things can make a big difference.
Yeah, it's about taking care of yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's empowering.
It is. It is.
It means we actually have some control over how we feel.
We do.
And then building strong social connections is huge.
Oh, yeah. Having those people you can talk to, who understand what you're going through and can offer that support.
Yeah, it's so important to feel connected.
It is. And, if you are struggling, please don't hesitate to reach out for help.
Yeah.
A therapist can give you that guidance and support,
Yes.
those evidence-based treatments that can really help you manage those challenges.
And it's a sign of strength to reach out,
It is.
It's not giving up. It's taking that step to get better.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I just want to leave our listeners with that sense of hope and possibility. Depression is a tough condition.
It is.
But it is treatable, and recovery is possible.
It really is.
You're not alone.
You're not alone.
Yeah.
And there is help out there.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the world of depression. We hope you found it informative.
Yeah.
And most importantly, empowering.
Absolutely.
Remember, knowledge is power, and understanding depression is that first step to managing it effectively and living a fulfilling life. Take care and keep learning.